of the Strategy Show, and today I would love to welcome our guest, Francis.
It's a
Francis, how
pleasure
are
to
you?
be here, Sasha. Thanks for having me.
Marvelous, marvelous. Pleasure to have you as well. So today we'll be talking a little bit about Southwest Airlines and analyzing the, let's call it, recent meltdown and how that ties into technology and how long-term strategy is should really be supported with technology choices, and technology is an enabler for to roll out long-term strategies, but obviously also avoid situations like the meltdown we've seen a few months ago, right?
Exactly, exactly. So the problem you might say that we're here to solve is one in which companies are unable to make the right decisions in their strategic planning. They may think they are, but they aren't. And the case of Southwest immediately comes to mind because it was so far reaching and so damaging. It destroyed shareholder value, the stock price fell, and millions of people were inconvenienced as they were stranded around different parts of the world because it turned out to have a worldwide impact. So, as our listeners may recall, back in December, there was a storm, and the storm led to a series of cancellations via it happened all around. We didn't know where it was coming from initially. It was happening everywhere in the world. It just seemed to be like, where is this thing coming from, and why is it happening? Because the storm wasn't that bad. It was fairly mild, but Southwest Southwest infrastructure was the one that was impacted. Let's not say the most, but it was impacted, and it forced flight crews and it forced pilots. They were unable to be scheduled into the correct slots so that they could be on their planes. And at first, Southwest blamed, and they still blame, the freak act of nature. But those who are on the inside and know better say that this was not that bad. This was not the snowstorm to LL snowstorms. What it was a perfect storm with respect to Southwest IT infrastructure. So go back in history, and if you were to understand sort of Southwest genesis, its formation, the CEO Herb Keller was the he wasn't the founder, he was one of the very first CEOs. But their philosophy has always been the cheapest possible IT. And by cheapest possible, I mean let's hobble together solutions based on bits and pieces of answers, of infrastructure, of software. And basically, it was held together by a string. So, as you know, IT folks know better than to follow this kind of strategy in the long term.
It's a
They
big
know,
no.
and they complain, right? They which is probably what happened at Southwest. Many people complained over many years, and it got to the point where in Southwest's short-term strategies, there was never a long-term commitment to fix the IT infrastructure. Why? Because if you're only looking 5 years out, then something that's going to take 7 years is always going to fall outside of the current window. So, they did what most companies do, which is short term strategy, one after the other. And eventually, this habit or this practice of kicking the can down the road meant that the critical infrastructure that they needed to upgrade never happened. As I said, it was always 7 to 10 years in the future, and they were always planning 5 years into the future. And consequently, the perfect storm finally came, which it does. As you know, if you're a technology professional and you're um, in charge of managing an infrastructure of a company, enterprise infrastructure, you know that at some point something's going to give. You just hope that you'd have moved on to your second, third, and fourth job by the time it does happen. Well, it
I
happened,
guess that's true, yeah.
and it happened at a very bad time at the almost the peak of the travel season, and millions of people were inconvenienced. And to this day, I went to the Southwest website and I'm reading their explanation of how it happened. They still don't take full responsibility for their poor planning. They
Interesting.
mention things here and there, and they say, "Oh, we're fixing the problem. Oh, we're assigning 1.3 billion dollars to our infrastructure," none of which really adds up to anything. So their response has not nailed the problem on its head, which means that it could happen again.
So I read somewhere that when one of the staff in customer service wants to look up which gate a plane would leave, they would be receiving 10 to 14 different responses depending on which software they consult. That's like saying, how much money do I have in my bank? And every app you open gives you a different amount.
Gives you a different number.
Yeah.
Exactly. So they knew something was wrong. And they probably had a bunch of workarounds, like a new person comes and sees all of this chaos, and they tell the new person, "Oh, don't worry, just call Bob in so and so, and he'll tell you what's really going on. If you get, don't follow these systems, just call Bob." And the person would call Bob, "Bob, what's going on?" And Bob would tell them, "Oh, the real story is that," because Bob is the one person in the company who knows how to pull all the shoelaces together and tie the thing and use the masking tape over here. I'm using these analogies, but this is what happens in companies when, and it's not a problem of immediate profit, because as our listeners probably know, Southwest has been ridiculously profitable. When other companies were doing terribly, Southwest Airlines only made a loss once prior to this in 1 year in 40 years of operation. So they've had a stellar record, and their stock has benefited as a result, and they've been held up as a paragon of a great airline. They were an example, like the best run airline. That's a kind of what they became known as. And as someone who flew Southwest, I really enjoyed the experience, several years ago, and found it fascinating. And the flight crew engaging, and we sang songs and they gave out prizes, and it was like experience. And but they had good strategy in terms of the hub and spoke system. The way they went to the secondary airports to keep costs down. That's how they could grow so fast, because they weren't competing for the most expensive slots. They found ways to appeal to the lower budget flyer, back when they were in their heyday. And they did really, really well. So that part of their strategy, the customer focused part, worked really, really well. However,
I wonder actually how we can, let's put ourselves in the shoes of Southwest. How can this happen essentially? Because many of the companies I come and I visit and I speak to, we often see a similar behavior. And this often stems from the fact that in the board of directors and the advisory board, there is actually nobody there with the right experience when it comes to connecting the business to the IT. Often IT people have a reputation of being a bit outworldly and living on not looking at reality for what it is, or at least a different version of reality. And I beg to differ. I believe there are plenty of very capable people, and as long as they are not included in the actual decision making, these situations will happen again and again and again. And then if you look at the companies where IT managers are represented in the right spots and help make the right decisions, you can actually see a fundamental leverage of IT becoming a main profit driver. It's just how you use it. If you treat it as an absolute necessity and you just want the cheapest solution out there, smack it all together a little bit, like with a shoestring, like you say, you rope it all together. Yeah, you end up with a very poor situation that will work maybe somewhat 50-50 for a while, and people can't really rely on the information. But yes, you have IT. And you have people who really embrace it and say, okay, let's take technology, and that's the other side of the spectrum, right? Let's take technology and truly embrace it, and let's let the IT do the work for us. Then you get a different situation, because all of the manual work is eliminated. That means the company can grow, and in the worst case, in economic situations we live in today, it can also shrink. it doesn't have that obstacle where it's 100% reliant on its people. The people are more focused on the core business, like
Right.
handling exceptions or dealing with
Right.
customers
Right.
or decision making or thinking, long-term planning. It all gets a new place. People are retrained in a different way, and that's mightily powerful. In the case of Southwest, apparently, sounds like they would want to take a page from that book and include some strong tech people in their decision-making processes.
Well, let's talk about that, because it's a problem that we're going to be discussing at the Sustainable Strategy Conference, Strategy Planning Conference coming up next week. Most boards, as you probably know, what it's not that gray hair gets you a place on the board, but that's kind of how it works out. And that gray hair means that the chances are high that you're not all that tech savvy. So you've been around board members who are still struggling with email. You know what I'm talking about. Even in companies where the technology usage is heavy, the board members aren't brought on because they have that background necessarily. They're brought on because they know finance, another one knows legal, another one knows markets, another one. But there's a really high possibility that the person who understands the severity of an issue isn't sitting at the boardroom table. That's just the nature of the beast. The people who know the most, the ones who are the most capable, the ones who have the best training, are lower in the organization, and they aren't on the short list of people to be on the board. So this is just, kind of how things work for most boards. So you get a situation like the one at Southwest, and chances are there wasn't a person in the boardroom who accurately estimated the problem of upgrading their IT infrastructure. There was no one there to advocate for that point of view and to say, over my dead body, do we keep kicking the can down the road? Instead, you're talking probably about lay people who are struggling to understand. So when they say they really need this, do they really need it? You get that kind of whiffle waffle kind of
exactly, right? Because they can't appreciate what it's actually about.
Because they're like, they've been, I imagine that, they've been saying these things for 40 years. Yeah, IT has been complaining for 40 years, but nothing has ever happened. Matter of fact, I remember a conversation with the CEO of Telecom, and I said to this person, you're having some major issues in your processes. The processes aren't working, and your folks are complaining about it, and they're going about the fixes in an ad hoc manner, which at some point is going to create a problem for your network. And his reply to me, he was a marketing person. His reply to me was, well, our customers aren't complaining. So, and I said, I tried to explain to him, and I failed, that's not how it works. That in complex situations where like a telecom or an airline in a company, you have multiple systems that are working with each other, and the way they work with each other is extremely nuanced, and there's a huge lag between cause and effect. So you fail to fix a line of code over here, and 10 years later you have a problem over there. And that's the nature of the beast. And if you're not actively upgrading and streamlining, and if you're not doing continuous improvement, if you don't have a Kaizen culture, you're essentially laying the seeds of problems that are going to come up in the future. And that's just how it works in those complex situations. Now, you may deny and obfuscate, and so the telecom is having all kinds of issues today that the people who I spoke to down in the bowels of the organization were predicting. They said this because this is just the nature of the animal that you're working with. But if an executive or board members don't appreciate what you and I just kind of probably for some reason, I'm an engineer by background, so this is kind of what
that explains why you understand the nuance of the story.
Somebody tells it to me, I have an immediate picture. I did process engineering as a young employee in my first days, so I have an idea, although I'm not an IT person in the way in which these folks are, or I'm not a telecom network person the way that the experts are. but I did work for a telecom company for 5 years for AT&T. So I had a real sense of, and I could estimate what they were telling me, and I could translate it into something I could tell the CEO. Again, I failed, but when you don't have that nuance, you create the seeds of destruction without knowing it. And that CEO, and I imagine the leaders of Southwest were all well-intended, but it's not enough. Your intentions aren't enough. At that level, you need more than good intentions, and you need to compensate. It's a conversation that we've had with strategic planning teams. They all need to compensate for that lack of understanding and nuance and insight by bringing people into board meetings who can educate them. There's one company that we spoke with that it was tragic, but the board members that they brought in tended to be more political appointees than anything else, because it was a government organization. So in our conversations with them, we said, it sounds as if you need to be training these board members before they even join the board. And they said, yeah, it's because it takes them 2 years to even figure out what the acronyms mean, let alone add real value. So if we could start at the very top, train board members, rigorous training, like testing after they've done the training, not sit in front of a screen and, check off a checklist, but actually test them, which is what some boards do around financial issues. They don't, as far as I know, they don't do it around IT issues. They'll bring on anyone who has any ignorance about IT, and they don't train them, they don't test them, they don't force them to learn. But essentially, that's what this client talked about doing, forcing new board members to go through a period of our orientation so that they could add value and not create Southwest-like problems.
Interesting. I see, like from where I'm sitting, I see a few issues in the larger picture as well. Is often the decisions about the IT fall back on the financial people, on CFOs, but they're notorious for making very short-term oriented decisions to keep their numbers clean. That is, again, in IT is a bad idea. You want to look at a situation for what it is and decide accordingly. You don't want to just cheap out, and that's what you often see when CFOs are making decisions. It's often cheaped out, and that's a challenge. And secondly, the part that I find most obvious in many organizations is a lack of continuous improvement. Where you take a company, like everybody's always sales first, sales first, sales first. That's great. Sales first is right, it's the right thing to do. However, you do want to make sure that you're evolving the organization behind it and maturing everything into the position, but you're also constantly improving. Because it's only through constant improvement that you really get somewhere, and it drives the organization forward. And that's where IT is really a fundamental player. And that culture of constantly improving often lacks as well. It's often a bit, you get this saying, what's that saying? Saying, don't change something that works. It's something like this, isn't it?
If it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah.
Like bonehead, real old style bonehead thinking.
Exactly. Yeah. It's not caught on the wheels anymore, is it?
Yeah, because you're creating your own problems. You're shooting yourself in the foot. You just don't know it yet. Unfortunately, boards will turn over before people realize that the decisions they made were faulty. So they've gone on to the next board or gone on to the next job, and they're gone, and they read something in the newspaper and say, "Oh, look how that happened." I imagine it happened at Southwest. All the prior board members who had collectively kicked the can down the road, I imagine they heard the news and they were like, "Oh, how did that happen?" Without having a clue that they helped to make it happen.
That's a fair remark. That's a fair remark. Who knows? Maybe there's a few of them listening. They should kick themselves up the bum.
Yeah, it's some reflection would be called for.
That's very interesting, because legacy software is a big factor that really holds everything back, isn't it? And that's a beautiful case here in the case of Southwest. When you have 10 to 14 systems, you have to go consult and hope you're going to find the right gate. That's problems just waiting to happen. And if higher up in the company, you cannot recognize that, either you're wearing the wrong glasses or you are so far detached from the reality of what happens on the floor. Probably both scenarios are far from advisable.
Right. Right. But it wasn't too long ago that I'm talking 5, 6 years ago that we were in prior to strategic planning retreats, we would have to work hard to convince CEOs that they needed to have an IT person in the strategic planning retreat. I mean, it was a struggle. Sometimes we'd have to bring someone in who wasn't even the IT person, but someone who knew something about the industry. So we'd have to work hard, labor to convince folks in that meeting that they needed that person because they didn't see it. I think today, after COVID, it's much more readily apparent. But back then, they would literally look at us with a, what are you talking about? Kind of look. Why do I need the guy who fixes the laptops? So because they couldn't conceive of the essential nature and the transformative nature of technology in their operations. That it wasn't at that level of immediacy or urgency. It was still in that nice to have and as little as we need bucket frame of mind, which is kind of what Southwest is all with, as little as we need, but no more. Because we're a people person, we're a marketing company, we're a people company, we focus on service. That all these other things are like,
and that's all correct, right? But the IT is there to enable you in order to do that. And when you misappropriate your funds and don't invest in it actively, then you're all of a sudden becoming an administrative company rather than a service company that's about people.
Right. That's right. Right. But it's not, I don't want to underestimate the problem either and say that it's easy for board members to appreciate these things. It's not. It's in a good strategic planning retreat, you have a kind of say it's not difficult, but you have a raw kind of give and take, I would say, between people from different disciplines. Because what has to happen in order for you to plan the future is that you need to understand where you are today. And coming to a common understanding is not easy because people come from different disciplines. And even if you have an IT person there, they may not be the best communicator. They may talk in a lot of jargon. They may not be able to convey the nuance of what they're saying, and they may not come prepared to talk about the cost of inaction. They may, have all the cost of the new network that they need to put in place, but they wouldn't talk about, what's going to happen when we start to have problems and the cost it's going to have on service and on customers and ultimately on shareholder value. So they may not be prepared to have that kind of conversation. It needs to happen quickly in a retreat. They may not be ready to educate their peers. And if they're not ready at that level, then even if you have the person there, you won't get to where you can create a snapshot of the current operation, because Southwest should have had an accurate snapshot of the dire nature of its IT network. And that should have happened. That should have been the first part of the retreat, where they looked at the whole organization and kind of came up with an understanding of where we are today, where all the disciplines would talk with each other and they would educate each other on here's where we are and here's where we're in trouble and here's where we're okay, here's where we're really good. So I don't want to underestimate the challenge of doing that when, for example, the people you're talking to don't have a technology background. So the IT person who enters a strategic planning retreat, whether have been on the board for 10 years, which is unlikely, it's more likely that they're new to the board or new to this activity, or they don't even belong on the board, or they're not even an executive, and they're in this weird place all of a sudden. Being there isn't enough. They need to be prepared and be prepared to explain that which is difficult to explain to people who don't have the background that you have. People say that IT and HR are similar in that way, that they both need to educate mainstream executives on the future and the current state, technology trends in ways that their colleagues can appreciate, understand, and be on the same page that they are, so that you can then plan for the future. Because as you imagine, if you're the IT person at Southwest, he could have been in the meeting, may have not gotten been to 10 years of meetings, never got the point across, and voila, 5-year plan, minimal commitment to change the infrastructure, and then a huge problem several months later.
It's a recognizable situation, most definitely. Even for myself, many meetings I'm in, I also fail to communicate the true necessity of certain decisions, because it's really hard to bring that point across when you don't understand the nuances of why that's happening, or why that situation is there. It's you can't I try to use metaphors wherever possible. You can't turn everything into a metaphor. Certain things are just complex, period. And it's if the other side of the table isn't willing to invest into understanding that issue, it's obviously rather difficult to bring that point across. Because we all speak different language, don't we? In a way, it might all be English, for example, but we all kind of speak a different language because we look at things from a very different perspective, and we use different jargon, and that really clashes a lot there.
I know we have a couple of comments in the chat, but I also wanted to mention that for those of us who are familiar with the Challenger explosion, which I imagine is most of us of a certain age, you ever seen that video or videos? Because there's a few videos and movies going around, documentaries, and they go back and they examine the conversations that did not happen or kind of half happened to decide whether to okay the launch of the Challenger that day. You ever seen those videos or any of those documentaries?
I haven't, no.
It's a little bit sad what we're talking about. A highly technical issue that there was partial information. The experts, the most seasoned experts said do not launch. And then they were convinced to change their opinion on the evening before the launch. And they called, this is Morton Thiokol, contacted NASA and gave them the green light. And they shouldn't, in retrospect, of course, now we know it was a huge mistake. But it all came down to the problem we're talking about, which is that those who were in the know and they've been in the know about this particular problem, the problem of the launch happening when the temperatures were low. Temperatures were low, the O-rings would become brittle, and then they would break. And if that happened, then the shuttle would be destroyed because the O-rings surrounded the fuel supply, and then it would cause it would be catastrophic. It wouldn't be, oh well, look at what happened. It would be that people would die. So they knew this, and they'd been saying it for months, years. Never got the audience they needed to. And on the evening before, they were basically feeling the pressure from the politics of the organization, and they gave in. They surrendered, and the rest is history. But they failed to get across the point. And the stories are tragic of the people who were in that room. Some committed suicide. This is this is the most extreme case, right, of what we're talking about. Probably it all came down to one meeting, and that one meeting, it dragged on for I think 3 or 4 hours, and it led to this poor decision that was made. But it's one of those cases where we as technology people really need to examine ourselves and understand, are we doing and saying and playing our part, so that in places where it counts, like decisions to launch a rocket, or in a strategic planning retreat, that we actually get heard. And again, that's not easy, but it's absolutely essential in this world that we live in.
Very interesting. Because it's a bit inherent to a lot of cultures to be on the side of short-term thinking, isn't it? It seems like we've lost our desire a bit for long-term thinking. I'm not sure why that is, but some things cannot work in the short term alone. There are certain decisions that you need to make in the long run. Where are you going to, right? If you want to compare it to something, let's go. I don't know. I mean, I'm in Belgium at the moment, so let's say let's go to Paris. Like, okay, that's great, but where do you need to stop to get petrol? You have stops you have to do in between. And I can see if you're not planning, if you're forgetting to say we're going to Paris, and you're just thinking in petrol stops, but you have no end destination, then you can see how you're creating a real a real deep issue.
Right. Well, you ask a good question, which is, where did this short-term orientation come from? I mean, we live in a consumer society where there's all these conveniences, right? And in a way, we're bamboozled into thinking that we don't need to think long. But that's not historically where mankind has come from. You as a citizen of Europe, you probably have visited cathedrals that took 4, 5, 600 years to build. So imagine someone launching a project like that today, to launch something that would take 600 years to build. What? You crazy? In our world, that's impossible. It's, oh no, we have technology that will solve that. Yeah, but we're missing the human commitment to something that's bigger than ourselves. And technology, while it's been great and it's allowed us to shrink all these cycle times, there are certain things that technology has not helped us to shrink, such as climate change. So when we come upon a bona fide problem that takes decades to solve, we're all over the place. And arguably, if you look at history, it sort of the shrinkage began right after World War II, sometime after World War II, because the mess of World War II led to the creation of long-term institutions, the like of which mankind had never seen before. The UN, the EU, the WHO, and so forth. They were created right after World War II because the world was in such a mess. And I guess as a species, as a race, we said, never again should these things happen at this scale. And just because we have the technology to blow each other up, well, that actually means that we need to be way more long-term in our thinking, because we now realize what short-term destruction we can wreak upon each other. So, we were very smart. But since then, if I study history, it looks like there's been a decline, to the point where we can't imagine creating long-term commitments the way mankind used to create these commitments. The Great Wall of China, there were these things that took hundreds of years, and we somehow committed to them anyway. No, we can't imagine doing that. There's a great
people now are afraid to make a commitment to go to the gym for more than 2 months.
Something has happened. It's not happened in the technology. It's happened up here, right? It's happened in our heads. Like 2 months? Are you kidding? I could never. And I need the week. I need the week-to-week plan, or I need the daily plan when it comes to going to the gym.
Exactly. Yeah.
So Benjamin Franklin, for example, he left £1,000 in his will to form a school, a trade school, kind of like an engineering school, but practical. And he stipulated in his will that the £1,000 that he left could not be spent. It could only be invested for 100 years. No, he is a smart guy, but is he smarter than any of us? But we could never imagine doing something like that. It's 100 years. So not only is he dead and gone, but you don't even know if your name is even going to be remembered. But anyway, his £1,000 turned into, I forget how many millions, but it funded the formation of the school some 150 or so years later. But is he all that different from us? Is he blessed with some level of IQ that we don't have? But the idea of leaving a gift like that today is like how is it that we can't conceive of making those kinds of long-term commitments? So the problem, you rightly said, is short-termism. And it's gotten worse since, in business anyway, since 9/11, then the recession of 2008, then COVID, now inflation and war and supply chain and so we're facing all of these. It seems like a never-ending sequence of short-term disruptors. And the argument in the face of all these disruptions is, oh no, we don't have time to think long-term.
Well, that kind of makes the long term more important, then, doesn't it? Because if you're
really
only thinking
does.
in crisis to crisis, you're shooting yourself in the foot again.
Right. And if you just look at it, if you have a long-term plan and a short-term plan, and in the next 5 years you have 10 disruptions, chances are the short-term plan is going to change every other week, but the long-term plan shouldn't change that much. Yes, it may change, but it's going to change far less than the short-term plan. So the argument that we don't need to have the long-term plan, we'll just bounce from one crisis to the other and recover as needed, is, from the point of view of a Ben Franklin, is lunacy. Or the creators of the UN is nuts. Or to a JFK who said, let's go to the moon in this decade, in 10 years, is like insane. We're in this level of collective business insanity, and we have things like Southwest, and we still are like futzing around wondering, how did that happen? Oh, it was the snow. We have climate change, and we're like, is that really a thing? we're all in that zone of kind of like crazy thinking. But we could do something about these things, but we would just need to give up our short-termism.
I feel the same. You can't work on the short term. All you're doing is just fixing micro issues that, and really in the bigger picture, they're not even that important.
They're forgotten. COVID has already kind of receded into, it's already dropping off of our radar, and we've gotten past it, and it's still around, but it's not what it used to be, and the variants aren't as bad, and we have somewhat decent vaccinations that kind of sort of work.
Yeah, at the risk of having a very unpopular opinion, but I'll take that risk anyway. I remember people queuing up to get their shots for a disease, but if you think about it, humanity's been having diseases, God knows how many hundreds of thousands of millions of years, and we're still here. So this kind of fear that grew within is, I'd like to think, also a consequence of short-termism. Just looking at what's in front of you instead of like a little bit further down the line. Like, does this all really have to be considered that bad? Like, let's take a chill here take a step back here for a minute and what's going on, and reorientate. How can we get around this obstacle to go back to our long-term goals, right?
Right. It's a valid question. Did we need to be so panicked about COVID? Because there was panic, right? And that panicky reaction, and did we need to? Can we put things in place that in the long term will prevent another pandemic from having the effect it had? And the answer to that surely is yes. I mean, that was, at least in the US anyway, that the pandemic responses were planned from the Obama years. They funded and put together institutions to deal with the next pandemic. So they had the foresight to do that, even though, as far as they knew, it may not happen in their lifetime.
True.
But that's kind of the nature of the game. When Benjamin Franklin and the builders of cathedrals and many others, you commit to doing things that you'll never see the fruits of, because you have a kind of intergenerational care. In other words, you care for the people who are going to come after you. There's a bunch of people now who are championing that point of view, the long-term future folks, championing long-term thinking about benefiting future organizations. When we first found out about climate change, which I think was the 80s, I believe, not exactly sure, if collectively mankind had said, oh, we're going to take care of the folks in the 2020s by doing what we need to do now, we wouldn't even be talking about ESG,
No,
or at
true.
least not the climate change, the E part of it, because the small changes that needed to come into effect to not produce the disaster that we're heading towards,
Mhm.
they would have been made.
That's very true. But the can has been kicked down the road for as long as
Once,
I remember.
once
Yeah.
again, it's kind of like Southwest.
It's complex problems, isn't it? As soon as it gets complex, people shy away from it. They go like, "Oh, I'm not touching this,"
Right.
and then
See,
it just keeps
that's
pushing forward, and I don't know. We have this saying. I think it counts in English as well. The short pain is often better than. Um, Essentially,
long-term.
the point is you kind of want to. Then it festers over time, and it just becomes worse and worse and worse. It's like a gangrene, isn't it? Like you take off the finger, or you lose the whole arm.
Or lose the whole body.
Or the whole body, for that matter.
Right.
Right. Exactly. Very interesting. Shall we have a look through the comments?
Sure. You want to go from top to bottom or bottom to top?
Yeah, we can do top to bottom. What about the
Top.
cases where the technology is great, but the leaders are not aligning with the technology? That's an interesting question. Does that
Arguably,
mean the
that's what happened at
technology is great,
Southwest.
or I don't know? I mean,
I think that's what happened at Southwest, right? The technology was there. They were better solutions than the ones they were using. I read somewhere that said that many airline companies write their own software because there's no off-the-shelf version of the solution that they need, so they have to create it on their own. So it's a tremendous investment as a result. So, but the ability to create that technology was there, but arguably, Shauna, the leaders of Southwest weren't aligning with the technology that could have been created if they had the willpower to do so. So it's an example of that.
Indeed. To be fair to finance people, Chris Fox, they've mostly had their fingers burned by IT projects which run over budget, over schedule, and miss the requirements, so it makes them pretty cautious. That's an interesting point, isn't it? From my perspective, we regularly see the reality where the desires of a piece of tech are often very misaligned with the needs. Like a thing of I need a car to go from A to B, but by the time you're building the car, all of a sudden the car needs to have a jet engine and needs to have wings, and preferably it should just become teleportation. And requirements often don't really align with the needs of the business. I'm a big advocate of first building with like fixing small problems that fit in the larger scale and expanding from there and gaining more traction from the company itself to then continue expanding in there actually. And this eliminates the problem where it misses the requirements because it's tailored to the needs of the business rather than sitting from the outside and going, oh, you know what, we should have this, we should have that. No, let's start with what we need. Then we can and implement that, and we get that up and running, and then we start building on top of that, and we start thinking, okay, fine, we've solved some problems today. That's great. Now let's look a bit further down the line. Let's look long term. Where are we actually going? Okay, let's start working in that direction, and stay away from this egocentrical thinking around what the tool should be doing according to somebody who is very far detached from the reality of the day-to-day usage of it.
Right. A more agile approach where you're
More agile
iterating,
approach, exactly.
iterating different kinds of solutions. Arguably, so Chris's point, of course, is well taken, and arguably the techniques around IT project development and complex project delivery, they've gotten better. Agile is clearly an improvement over waterfall, right?
Yes.
And that ego business that you talked about, that's kind of how they used to be run, and with the overruns and lack of information and lack of progress, at the end of it, nothing to show for it, in some cases. Those days are for the most part they're receding, but the memory of them is still exists.
Indeed.
And So Chris is right. I think there's improvements have certainly been made, and then there's a whole much further way to go. At the very least in how IT projects are communicated.
Yes, communication is that's a fair point, a key part here. Yeah, that's true. Let's have a look. What if some assumptions or your industry competitive position is fundamentally disrupted?
Yeah. It's an interesting term, fundamentally disrupted, right? Because in the absence of a long-term strategic plan, everything looks like a fundamental disruption. Because the term fundamental disruption is, it exists only in a context. It only makes sense in a context of some larger commitment.
Mm-hmm.
So when a new technology comes along, what companies with long-term strategic plans, and I mean 15 to 30 years out, which is what we're going to be discussing and working on during the conference. Companies that have that kind of strategy, when there's a disruption, it's actually very straightforward. You re-examine your strategy, you look at the assumptions that went into it, and you ask yourself, is this a material disruption or not? No, when you don't have this strategy and all you're doing is reacting from one disruption to the next, then everything looks like a fundamental disruption because you have no overall context that you're executing against. So the answer is not more short-termism. The answer is a long-term commitment with updates and upgrades and re-examination as needed.
That's a very, very interesting point to make, actually, yes. What I would suggest, Francis, let's tell our viewers and listeners about the upcoming conference, and then we can also pop a link in the comments, so people.
Sure. I'm not seeing where I can pop a link in the comments. I was kind of searching for that. Do I have the ability to do that?
Yes, you should do. After we finish the stream, we can add links in the comments.
Okay, after. Okay, great.
Yeah.
So the conference will be on the 22nd and 23rd of June. And as I said before, it's a sustainable strategic planning conference. The theme is transcend short-termism, and there's a pause, build long-term value. So we're out to tackle and hopefully destroy the tendency to think short, which has become so prevalent in corporations. There's the majority of companies have now receded into just their basically 3 and 5 year plans, which basically are just an extension of the plans that they've already had in the past. So in other words, it's a commitment to status quo plus a little bit of this and that here and there. No, they don't necessarily know that that's what they're doing, but that's essentially what the end result is. But we're saying that you can accomplish big things, big, hairy, audacious goals, amazing strategic intents. You can send men and women to the moon. You can do your own version of a moonshot in your company. But you need to think with this resource that we all have, which is time. Time is an essential resource when you're thinking of accomplishing very big breakthroughs. And you essentially can't do without it. Even if you produce the breakthrough in 5 years, you still need to be thinking, where is this organization going in the long term? So to transcend short-termism and to build long-term value, that's the job of we have about 30 speakers from around the world. It's really really humbled by folks who have stepped up, because it's not a popular topic in the sense that everyone is beating on our doors saying we need more long-term thinking. But there is a pretty quiet movement, and it's strong and it's solid, and it tends to be led very much by CEOs, especially of major corporations, who were forced into short-term thinking during their tenure and are now coming out and saying that it was terrible and it can't work. So our speakers come from that kind of experience, and they'll be giving practical advice and also new mental models, new ways to think about creating long-term value. So 22nd and 23rd, and the URL, if you're listening in, is http:// https://strategyconf.fwconsulting.com. And you can also, of course, just hit up my LinkedIn page. You'll see mention of it all over my page on LinkedIn, and you can connect with me on LinkedIn.
Marvelous. I'm looking forward to the conference. Francis, it's been a pleasure having you as a guest, and everybody else. I hope we thoroughly enjoyed the talk as much as I have, and looking forward to also speaking on your conference.
Me too. Right. Sorry, Sasha. I forgot to mention that Sasha is one of our speakers. Duh.
Indeed.
My apologies.
That's all good.
Great to have you on board.
Thank you.